Welcome to Crash Course, a podcast about business, political, and social disruption, and what we can learn from it. I'm Tim O'Brien. Today's Crash Course, Putin versus Ukraine's forgotten war. In early 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a sprawling, brutal follow-up to his land grab of Crimea in 2014. Casualty figures are hard to assess precisely, but tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed or wounded on both sides of the war, with the full tally estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands. The war initially produced an international show of support for Ukraine and its embattled leader, Volodymyr Zelenskiy. After all, the broader fate of Western Europe hung in the balance, a consequential geopolitical reality for the United States as well. And Ukraine itself fought back courageously, beating back waves of murderous assaults and defying expectations that it would quickly buckle. But wars are entrenched, stubborn things. And as Putin's troops, missiles, and tanks laid waste to Ukraine, and as Ukraine responded in kind, a military stalemate has settled in. The Gaza War has now captured the world's attention and headlines, diverting attention from Ukraine. Further financial and military aid for Ukraine from Europe and the US has dried up. Yet the stakes haven't changed, and the world remains at risk. Joining me today to discuss the Ukraine war is Marc Champion, a columnist with Bloomberg Opinion. Marc has lived and worked in Russia, reported from Ukraine, and has covered foreign affairs extensively for a number of leading publications. He is wise and shrewd, and he joins me today from our London office, where he's based. Greetings, Marc.
Hi.
So tell me a little bit before we get into the specifics of Vladimir Putin's journey as Russia's president and the war in Ukraine, a little bit about your own journey as a correspondent, particularly the time you spent in Russia, and what you learned from those years.
Yeah, well, I first went to Russia when it was still the former Soviet Union and was there for just at the very end before the collapse, and then went back right afterwards and stayed for about 7 years. So this was the time of Yeltsin. It was the time of great hope in some ways for reform. There was a big pro-Western sentiment among especially younger urban Russians. And
Privatizations. Waves of privatizations.
Yes. And very quickly, economic pain and disappointment, resentment, across much of the country, which really suffered terribly as the whole system came apart economically and so on. But I think, looking back, there are two things that really strike me as things I didn't quite understand the importance of at the time. One was that I had many friends, almost all of them would have been younger and kind of pro-Western. But I remember that whenever you would start to talk about Ukraine, it was almost always there was a skepticism that it really was a country. And that, I think, is important to remember.
Among younger Russians.
Younger Russians,
yes, just not expats, but Russians themselves.
Not at all. No, This is about Russians. And, I think it's important to remember when we talk about this as Putin's war and so on, and we wonder as to why he has support for some of the things that he's doing. It's just important to remember that what it is to be Russian, what it was to be Russian, was very confusing at the time. It was the first time in centuries there had never been a Russian state in the borders that existed in 1991. And so that was a confusing time, and where Russia stopped, what it was to be Russian. These are things that have been getting worked out ever since 1991. And in many ways, I think that is exactly what's happening now. And sometimes it's difficult for us to understand it. We tend to be so self-obsessed. We think it must be about something that we did or we didn't do. And we forget that other countries have histories and agencies. So looking back, that's very important. And I think the second thing that I would say is that, there was a really huge moment in 1993 when you may remember that Boris Yeltsin blew up the parliament. About 150 people died just under, and there was, days of fighting. And we all remember that as a constitutional crisis, struggle for power, which essentially it was. But what's often forgotten is that one of the reasons that parliament was made up predominantly of communist party members of the new Communist Party and also nationalists. And one of the things that they had consistently clashed with Yeltsin over was that they refused to ratify what were called the Bielorussia-Push Accords. And what that was the moment when Yeltsin, with some other leaders, the leader of Ukraine in particular, and of Belarus, they dissolved the Soviet Union, essentially. And the parliament was refusing to ratify that. And we forget that right from the beginning, there was a resistance throughout the system in much of the population to this idea that the Soviet, they had to accept the loss of empire.
And everything that goes with that.
Everything that goes with it.
Prestige, self-esteem.
Absolutely.
Economic wealth, military power, et cetera, et cetera.
So in many ways, I think what we are seeing is the delayed playing out of all of those unresolved issues.
A response to the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And Putin, really, his rise is in the wreckage of all of the moments around that, from the dissolution of the Soviet Union to botched privatizations, where there was a feeling among average Russians that the privatizations really benefited a kind of financial and political elite in Moscow and not in other parts of the country.
Right.
Yeltsin brings Putin in, always mysteriously to me, why he never recognized that Putin could potentially be a threat or had the appetites in him to end up where he's ended up. But at the time, Yeltsin was a dysfunctional leader, essentially struggling with alcoholism. Is that a fair?
Yes, he had issues with alcoholism.
Yeah.
He had heart trouble. He had heart surgery. He was at the end.
And then Putin essentially moves in, and very quickly, this is in January of 2000.
Exactly. So he takes over in 2000. 99 is the end of Yeltsin, and Putin takes over, this young, much younger, much fitter, dynamic, but kind of, enigmatic character. We didn't know a lot about him. Russians didn't know him. They'd only really come to have any kind of recognition of who he was as a result of the Second Chechen War that began towards the end of, in the second half of 1999. It was a very rough war, and that really put Putin on the map.
And he embodies these resentments against the loss of empire and sort of, I think, what he regarded as a pernicious Western influence.
Yeah, well, there was definitely a kind of progression. In fact, he was doing his marathon annual kind of Q&A session, and he kind of mused about this, and he talked about how he was naive at the beginning. He'd thought that he could make friends with the West, that the West would work with Russia, would make room for Russian interests and all that sort of thing. And so that's the narrative that I think he would like us to see, which is that he had the best of intentions, that it wasn't his fault, it was the West's fault, that they didn't treat Russia properly, didn't give it respect or room, tried to humiliate it, and therefore we are where we are. That's his narrative. I think the whole idea of a career KGB officer who then cut his teeth in St. Petersburg in a kind of basically mafia-like environment, that he was naive and put upon and so on by, wily Western leaders and diplomats, kind of unlikely. But there is something to the fact that it took time to recognize exactly what it was that, the West was willing to accept and, what they saw as legitimate Russian interests. And that those were absolutely not the same as the ones that he figured that he needed to further and protect.
And presumably very early on, Ukraine in his own imagination and his practical day-to-day affairs as a Russian leader, Ukraine is a thorn in his side.
He has been obsessed with Ukraine for a very long time. And the first time it really kind of burst onto the scene was with the 2004 Orange Revolution. And he saw this as a threat to Russian interests. These were basically pro-Western, pro-democracy, and therefore pro-Western protests against a leader who Russia had been comfortable with. So that's 2004. You had this big fight. Viktor Yanukovych wins the election, but through fraud in Ukraine. You then have these big protests, and he's forced to redo the election, loses with a real count, and then is replaced by somebody who is kind of pro-European and setting Ukraine on a different path. And to Putin, who does not believe in popular agency, it is leaders who make decisions, he saw this as a threat. And he spends the next decade trying everything through energy blackmail, giving money, giving cheap energy, taking it away. He tried everything to maintain Ukraine within his sphere of influence, keep it out of the US and European sphere of influence, the way that he saw all this. And, finally, 2014, you have another big protest revolution on the streets. Again, it is Yanukovych, who is Putin's guy, who gets thrown out. And that was it. That was Putin deciding that I can't do this through these various different tools, economic tools and so on, are going to have to use force.
And tell me, during the arc of that first decade and a half after Putin comes to power in 2000, how did Ukrainians generally see this? Because it wasn't with a unified voice. There were parts of the country that remained strongly pro-Russia.
Absolutely.
And there were significant, obviously, parts of the country that also were looking west, away from Moscow and away from Putin. How were these popular uprisings generally received within Ukraine itself?
So Ukraine was a very divided country, and you could see that in pretty much every election. You'd see it just kind of split down the middle. Or actually, what you saw was a moving line. If you think of the country's politics in colors, the orange color has been for the Orange Revolution of 2004, and ever since it's been the color of often the opposition, but of the kind of pro-European, pro-Western track. And blue has been the color of the more pro-Russian track. And that was Yanukovych's party color. And you could see when you had these electoral maps, you could see the zone of orange creeping from basically being more or less in the west and more than half the country blue. And it just kind of crept across. It overtook all of Kiev and, the central parts of Ukraine. But the thing that really changed everything was 2014. It was the decision to annex Crimea and then to foment a conflict in the east of Ukraine. I was in Crimea at the time. I went to the Donbass region at the time, and it was really clear what was happening. But at that time, for example, I was in Mariupol a number of times, 2014, 2015, and Mariupol was really a solidly pro-Russian city, but Bryansk also nearby it. All along that southern coast, people had very divided loyalties. They'd always voted solidly blue. And I went back just before the war, but you got 8 years after that. After 2014, Crimea's taken, begins this war that really there's a ceasefire, but it continues at a low level for 8 years. So I went back just shortly before the invasion began in February 22. So I was there in January, early February. And I went back to Mariupol. I spent a bunch of time there. It was transformed. Whereas it had been really a solidly pro-Russian city, now even the people from the blue parties were not pro-Russian. They might not like the orange parties in Kiev, that didn't like them at all, wouldn't vote for them. They had their own parties, but they did not want to be part of Russia.
But let's slow down for a sec on that point. Was that because of the 2022 invasion? Or had that sentiment already solidified before that?
This was before. So I specifically went to
what gave rise to it? Why did an area that had been so deeply blue, so pro-Russian, get swept up into the Orange Revolution and affiliation with Ukraine?
There are a number of things. One was that the annexation of Crimea and then the violence that followed in the east, over time, those started to be deeply resented. And you have to remember, just the front line that the ceasefire created, and there were trenches where there's daily firing. They're only like 100 meters apart in many places, the Russian and the Ukrainian trenches through those 8 years. And there's constant firing, constant fighting, constant body bags. And I think that it's about 20 kilometers from the center of Mariupol, just not far from the suburbs. And people died. There was shelling into the city and people got killed. And over time, a resentment built. And also they could see what happened in the occupied parts of the Donbass, parts of the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions were successfully occupied and behind
by the Russians.
By the Russians and separatists.
Yes.
They were behind these trenches. And Ukrainians could see what was going on behind there, and it did not look pretty. It was run by a mix of clowns and mobsters, with Russian agents, as the first defense minister was a Russian former military intelligence. If there is such a thing as a former intelligence officer, people understood that this was a very manipulated situation. It did not produce anything good for the people who were living there. It didn't look like a future that people in Ukraine wanted.
And presumably, Putin saw the annexation of Crimea as a sort of warning shot to the rest of Ukraine. I'm asserting my authority in the region. If you stay in this direction, I will come in and fix this for myself. But in reality, what the annexation did was solidify opposition, at least in Crimea, in southern Ukraine, against Russia, and turn what had been a solidly blue area orange.
Yeah, I mean, Crimea itself, of course, was gone, and it's the only part of Ukraine, the only province of Ukraine that had a majority of ethnic Russians living there. The whole east and south is predominantly Russian-speaking, but the Kherson region, for example, which has been fought over, and the Russians took Kherson, it was the only provincial capital that they took, in this latest invasion, and then they lost it. But that region was 14% ethnic Russian, but almost, entirely heavily Russians. And the huge mistake that Putin made was to think in 2022 that he was invading the Ukraine of 2014. And secondly, that if people are Russian speaking, they must be basically Russian. And he wrote a long essay before the invasion, a year before the invasion. It's a 5,000-word essay all about, the connections between Russia and Ukraine and his version of the history. Very dubious. But nevertheless, he spent a lot of time clearly thinking about it. And it's clear he wrote it, not some flunky. And that showed how he thought about Ukraine and explains a lot about why he got it wrong.
And what was the clear takeaway from that essay in your mind?
That his belief was that Ukraine was essentially, along with Belarus, a part of Russia, of the Russian people. And during the Russian Empire, it had always been called, Little Russia. And Ukrainians were Little Russians. So his view was that these are really one people and they belong together. As he said, the borders, Ukraine was created by Lenin when they drew the borders. And before that, Ukraine hadn't really existed. And it's all, Lenin's fault. And that's all in there. And of course, Ukrainians have a national history. They've just been part of an empire for centuries and mostly unwillingly.
And they see it as their specific history.
Yeah.
And that they own that history. And it's not going to be expropriated by anyone else.
They do. And that version of history that Putin wrote was the version that everyone was taught, throughout the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union and so on. And so Ukraine, just as much as Russia, was having to work out after 1991 what it meant to be Ukrainian. Where was Ukraine? What was Ukraine? Just as Russians were. This is a process that's been going on.
On that note, Marc, I want to take a quick break to hear from one of our sponsors, and then we'll come right back. I'm back with Marc Champion, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist, and we're discussing the war in Ukraine. Marc, you were laying out quite eloquently and with great specificity the context for Putin's paranoia about Ukraine, his desire to reassert Russian control over Ukraine, and how the Ukrainians themselves saw all of this. And one thing you pointed out in the top of the show was that whatever Putin's goals were when he annexed Crimea, he ended up getting the opposite result. He didn't tamp down an interest in independence among Ukrainians, and he didn't make Ukrainians more loyal to Russia. But apparently he didn't learn that lesson very well, because in 2022, he mounts a full-scale invasion, maybe because he didn't get the results he wanted in 2014, but he certainly seems to have expected something very different in 2022 than what he got, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, we know for a fact that when the Russians came in columns, not only did they not form the columns in the way that you would if you were going in to fight a war, which left them very vulnerable, they also carried parade uniforms with them and only a few days' supply of food. Clearly, the idea was that they expected to more or less march into the major cities, take over the administration. There wouldn't be much fighting, if any, and it would all be done very smoothly, rather like in Crimea, which was an unbelievably successful operation, virtually without bloodshed, and very, very smooth.
How did he get it so wrong? Because so many things have emerged since that invasion. The mighty Russian war machine was inept and bedraggled and poorly led. The machinery itself wasn't in top condition that he was relying on. And he clearly underestimated the kind of opposition that he would encounter and that his military would encounter. How did that happen, given that Putin is a well-known control freak and scoops up as much information as he can about the things he oversees, yet there appear to have been massive gaps in his knowledge?
Yeah. I mean, I think the best explanation of that is that he built a system and coterie around him entirely based on loyalty rather than merit, etc. And over time, as so often happens in these kinds of regimes, people stop telling him things that they don't think he wants to hear. And so I have no doubt that there were people in the Russian intelligence service, precisely because they were deeply penetrated into Ukrainian security agencies, etc., who knew what was going on. But the question is what rises through all the way to the people who actually engage with Putin and what they are willing to tell him and what story they want to tell him, because they may have an agenda of their own in terms of what they want him to actually do. So, there's a lot of talk also about, there was the COVID period when he was very, very isolated. I think it was Lavrov who once supposedly quipped, not quite recently.
Sergei Lavrov,
the foreign minister, when someone asked him, so who does Putin take advice from? And he just mentioned 3 different tsars and himself. I think there was a big element of that.
Were you surprised when he invaded?
Well, the reason I went to Mariupol was that I was convinced that he would. Not because I had some special insight or anything, but it was very clear that there were 2 things going on. One was that the Americans were shedding a lot of intelligence, making it public and saying very clearly that this was going to happen. And while I'm not a huge believer in everything that American intelligence says, this made a lot of sense. And there was so much going on the ground that only made sense if they were going to go in. This was the 2nd year in which they had piled up troops against the border. And so it didn't surprise me at the moment it happened. What was interesting was talking even to people I've known for, frankly, decades who advise the Kremlin and are talking to them. They genuinely, I'm absolutely convinced of that, they weren't sort of making it up. They genuinely did not think he would do it because in their view, it was not rational. And it would be, as one of them put it, just a week or 2 before the invasion, a couple of weeks, it would be catastrophic for Russia's interests.
Like firefighters who run into burning buildings instead of out of them, Marc is a foreign correspondent who runs toward a looming war rather than run away from it. I think it speaks to both his incredible dedication to his job and his courage. When you were in Mariupol, were you also surprised in any way by the sentiments you were encountering among Ukrainians themselves that gave you an inkling of how courageous and purposeful their own response to the invasion would be?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there were a few things that struck me. One was that, if you talk to over 65s, in the suburbs, there was still a pro-Russian kind of current there. So that's one thing that struck me, was that it's not like everybody had changed their views. The second was that, as I mentioned before, the sort of huge change compared to a time when it had been just solidly pro-Russian. And even the mayor, who was, from the Blue Party, he was very much pro-Ukraine and so on. And it was clear that they would fight. That was clear to me. But also, what was very striking is that in the entire time, I don't think I met anybody who thought, among the Ukrainians, and certainly Zelensky, the president, didn't think that the Russians were actually going to invade.
And Zelensky himself turned out to be a much more capable and courageous leader than some thought he might be when the war first started. But also, at least it was curious to me how torn some Western powers were at the time about whether or not to commit themselves to support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia, particularly Germany, which I think was a little bit slow off the mark early on, and other European nations. What accounted for some of that early hesitation?
Well, I think it's different for different countries. I mean, Germany is a really good example. Germany just had so far to travel. They had an Ostpolitik, as they called it, for a very long time, which was always about engaging Russia economically, kind of drawing it in so that it would have an interest in being cooperative rather than disruptive. And they stuck with that long after, many people, especially in Eastern Europe, were warning them that this wasn't really working. And there was, for example, with the annexation of Crimea, there was some evidence there to say that it wasn't. But nevertheless...
And all the while becoming heavily dependent on Russian energy exports.
Exactly, on Russian energy, and a huge investor in Russia. So with a great deal to lose. So when this happened, when the invasion happened, that policy just suddenly was incinerated. But they just had so far to travel to get from that kind of Ostpolitik all the way over to Germany, post-war Germany, actually arming a country to fight Russia. They just had a really long way to go. And actually, in terms of Germany, I think they moved a lot faster than I would have thought.
Eventually, the West did develop a coordinated response. And I shouldn't say just the West. Japan was an active participant in the response. But arms, money, and economic sanctions eventually followed, all in an effort to support Ukraine, isolate Russia, and try to bring the war to a conclusion. NATO became more fortified, which I think is something Putin didn't want and probably didn't expect out of this action. And it went so well for Ukraine in some of the early stages, and that's putting aside all of the deaths that the country has had to absorb and all of the grotesque aspects of warfare that accompanied those deaths. But it did not only make a strong stand, it actually began progressing towards the Russian border in its own military efforts, which I don't think anyone expected. Here we are now, it's reached a stalemate. And all of these countries that have supported Ukraine till now are definitely wavering. I'm not saying they're turning their back yet, but the tens of billions of dollars in financial and military aid that has flowed from Western Europe and primarily the UK and Germany, and then the United States, tens of billions of dollars more, is up for grabs. How did we get there? How did we end up in a place where people are having doubts about whether or not to continue to support Ukraine?
Right. Well, I think there are two ways to look at this. If you look at it from outside, from the point of view of the Americans, the Germans, the French, the UK, etc. So from that point of view, I think there was, as so often in these cases, a mismatch of expectations. So the expectation was set, after Ukraine started to do well, that the measure for winning was actually, it was to take territory back. And of course, that was encouraged by the Ukrainians who wanted their territory back. Politically, it became impossible to say we're not going to take it all back. So you had Zelensky saying we're going to carry on fighting until we take back Crimea, and we're right back to the borders in 2013, right back to the 1991 borders when we had everything. Those expectations were unrealistic from the start. And the reason you need to sort of look at it from two sides is that from the Ukrainian point of view, they were unrealistic because the West chose to drip feed arms to Ukraine. So at the moment when the Russians were unprepared and when they were losing territory, they hadn't dug in, and the Ukrainians had momentum, and they even had more personnel in the field than the Russians did. At that moment, the Ukrainians did not have what it would take in order to push their advantage all the way through. They didn't have enough combat jets. They didn't have enough tanks. They didn't have enough longer range missiles. They just didn't have enough of anything. If they'd had everything they have now back in last fall, then this would have been over. That's the Ukrainian point of view. The reason that the stuff was drip fed was that there was always a concern in the US in particular, which was really calling the shots, that escalation management. You wanted to make sure that the Russians didn't panic and push a red button, of one kind or another. So they really wanted to kind of stage things. We don't know, for example, what conversations the Americans might have been having with the Chinese. We know that the Chinese have had some influence on the Russians, do not want this to turn into a nuclear conflict and so on. There's stuff that we may not know until archives are opened about, everything that went on behind the scenes. But it's clear that escalation management was a big deal and that it governed how things were distributed and at what pace.
Marc, let's take a quick break on that note, and then we'll come back to this very interesting conversation. I'm back with Marc Champion, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist, and he is educating me about what a stalemate in the Ukraine war might involve. On that note, Marc, the idea of a stalemate, what's at stake for Europe and the U.S. specifically, in addition to Ukraine, of course, if military aid and financial support doesn't continue? Packages have been held up recently in the United States. Republicans in Congress have blocked about $60 billion in U.S. aid to Ukraine. And more recently, Hungary blocked a package of about $55 billion in EU aid to Ukraine. That's life support, literally and figuratively, for Ukraine. What are the consequences of drawing all that down?
I mean, they are severe. So I think if we start from the point of view of what happens on the ground, the important thing to understand, and categorically to understand, is that the consequence of stopping support for Ukraine is not peace. The consequence is loss. and it will be many human lives lost. It will be territory lost, and it will be sovereign independence of a country lost. The Russians have made this very, very clear. Putin has made it clear. The Russian ambassador at the UN said, we're happy to talk to Ukraine about a ceasefire, but it will require their capitulation. And Putin reiterated what our goals are. He was asked, well, what would it take to have peace in Ukraine? And he said, well, we'll have peace in Ukraine once our goals are achieved. Same as he said in 2022. It's denazification, which means regime change. It's demilitarization, which means disarmament. So one has to kind of bear in mind that the option for a peace and ceasefire where everybody just stops fighting does not exist, because Russia is very confident now. They now believe that they can win, having been kind of humiliated for a couple of years. Nevertheless, they can ultimately win.
I think in that same speech you referenced from Putin, he said he believed that momentum was on his side in the war now, too.
It absolutely is. I mean, he's correct. What's happened this year is that the Ukrainians attempted a counteroffensive, and it ran into sand. There is a stalemate, but those can be easily broken. And the Russians are the ones who are on the offensive now across the east.
For Europeans and Americans who are saying, how does it really hurt us to stop paying for this war? Why should we? There's all sorts of social needs in our own countries that we could use tens of billions of dollars for. Why keep paying for this effort? How do you answer that kind of a question?
Well, I think the first one is have some perspective, right? So yes, $55 billion from Europe, something similar, even a bit more from the US. There's a group called the Ramstein Group, which is, since the beginning of the invasion, it's been meeting to organize what to get to Ukraine. The combined GDP of the Ramstein Group is $47 trillion. This is affordable. So the first thing is that when people start saying, oh my gosh, 50 billion in the EU, this is, again, a multi-trillion dollar economy. So 50 billion is affordable. The second is that it's not we pay it or we pay nothing, because the consequences of having a Russian victory mean that you will then have to deal with and prepare for all kinds of new eventualities which are created by facts on the ground. The fact that, as in Belarus, where the Russians have said they're stationing their nuclear missiles now, the situation in Ukraine will be very different. I mean, Putin said he was talking about, what was Russian and so on, and Odessa is Russian in his view. So that also is unfinished business. If he's in Odessa, he's right next to Transnistria, which is a breakaway pro-Russian piece of Moldova. The Russians have spent billions to try and destabilize Moldova. They will go in. Then they're on the border of Romania, which is an EU country. It changes everything, like, in a game of Risk. When you control different pieces of territory, it changes the nature of the game. And Europe and the US will have to pay to prepare and adjust for these different things.
So if they don't pay now, they'll pay later.
They will pay later. They will pay more.
I'm curious about how this has all affected Putin's standing and leadership within Russia. There was a lot of speculation that if he was to be removed from power, it would have to involve some sort of an internal coup or meaningful opposition at the highest levels within the Kremlin, and that if this war dragged on for a long time, over time perhaps his invincibility would erode and you might see action against him. That certainly appears to have changed as well, but maybe this is just reading tea leaves without any real certainty. But I'm curious how you think about that.
To me, this idea that he was at political risk has always been a fantasy. He's never been at political risk. He's not dumb politically. He made mistakes in Ukraine, strategic mistakes, and he has some, I think, misguided ideas about foreign policy and Russia's place in the world, what it needs to be. But politically, he's not dumb at all. He built a system. He understands it completely. And it's not for nothing that he called, this invasion by close to 200,000 troops a special military operation and not a war. He wanted to sell this to Russians as something that he's got in control. It's not existential, and we have this. So I think even if he had had to settle and stop, he would have been fine politically. He'd be fine. Now, of course, he's got the bit between his teeth again. He has the opportunity to show that he didn't make a mistake, that Russia is capable of being the kind of great power again that he was trying to demonstrate in the first place. So he's, in a stronger position he's been for a while.
He's been willing to essentially put tens of thousands of troops through a meat grinder, sending them onto a battlefield almost as cannon fodder. Russia's emptied out its prisons to populate its military forces. There had been one argument that if there wasn't any kind of a coup against Putin at the very top, there might be popular sentiment that gained so much momentum once average Russians and grandmothers saw their sons disabled or killed in this war, that you might see a groundswell from the bottom up. But I take it you don't think that's likely either.
No, not at all. I mean, Putin understands his own military very well. He knows how they fight. And, once it all become clear this is going to be a proper war, he knew how ugly it will be. And for that reason, he has not issued a general mobilization, which would affect the children of the elites and the middle classes in Moscow and St. Petersburg, etc. The recruitment, as you say, has been in prisons. It's also been predominantly in provinces, in villages, where not only is sort of political power more dispersed, so it's less likely that you're going to get, a coordinated protest. Also, families are being offered quite significant compensation when their sons or husbands and fathers die. Relative to the salary that someone can expect in a small village in Siberia, these compensations are very significant. So that has all helped to make sure that there isn't a big blowback. And so far, he really hasn't seen it.
If he emerges as a victor in this war in Ukraine and solidifies control over the entire country, what do you see as the first steps he takes in the wake of that, strategically and tactically? Like, what would his next moves be?
Well, I think he is now convinced that he is at war with the West. He is at war with the US. He's at war with Europe. So I think if he succeeds, I suspect the first thing, as part of that success, I think he would move into Moldova. So he would have that done through the battlefield, if you like. And at that point, I think there would be a considerable pause as he reconsolidates militarily and so on. I mean, Russia is now has rejigged its economy so that it is now a war economy. They're producing 3.5 million artillery shells a year now. And that, I am quite convinced, would continue, if not quite at the intensity that it is now. The budget for 2024, I think it's close to 40% of the budget is defense. So it might not be at quite that level, but it would continue at a high level. And he would re-equip and get ready, in his view, because he's at war with the West, remember, and that now Finland is part of the West because it joined NATO and Sweden, etc. The whole kind of strategic situation in the Baltic Sea has changed. So he would be preparing for the worst that his generals can imagine can happen. So there would be a buildup of forces along the Finnish border, and there'd be a big buildup in the Baltics, I think. And what would happen, would he make efforts to destabilize the Baltic states? Yes, I'm quite sure. Would he invade? I'm not so sure about that. He probably would feel he doesn't need to. When you invade a NATO country, that's a pretty high stakes move.
2024 will be an election year in the U.S. Do you see a material difference in how the U.S. responds to Putin in a Biden administration versus a Trump administration?
Absolutely. That would have been a different question if we were seeing the first Trump term. If we remember, you could see Trump's instincts. Doesn't care about NATO, is quite friendly towards Putin, is totally disinterested in the kind of strategic game in Europe. But, he had people around him, generals and so on, who he'd appointed to his own administration, who had a much more traditional view of U.S. interests. If he comes to power a second time, none of those people will be there. Only loyalists will be there. And they will be pre-vetted to make sure that they will implement the policies that he wants. And, those may be fairly erratic. I'm not sure that Trump has a specific set of foreign policies, but they will be there to do his bidding.
Marc, I always like to ask guests what they've learned about topics that we're discussing. And as a veteran observer of Russia and Putin, what have you learned in recent years about him and his country's aspirations in the world?
Well, I have to say, so I became a journalist because I wanted to go to Russia. I wanted to go to the former Soviet Union, didn't want to be a spy or a diplomat to do that. So I had to be a journalist, and I'm glad I did. So I obviously had a pretty deep interest and fascination for, love for Russia, lived there for 7 years, had a wonderful time, got married there, etc. The process since has been one of gradual loss of hope and disappointment. And by this point, I see it's very difficult to imagine, even post-Putin, a regime that's very different from the one that we have now in Russia in my lifetime. And the turning from the West, I think it's going to last a while. It's not permanent, but it's going to last quite some time. It will become quite deep, I think. And yeah, it's rather depressing. And unfortunately, I do believe, as I don't think I would have said, some years ago, I do believe that this is an empire collapsing. Unhappy like all empires are with its collapse and resisting it. It's always ugly. If you do not make it clear to Russians and to Putin in particular now, but Russians more generally and whoever succeeds him, that it's over with the empire, they need to learn to live in their new skin, then we will be fighting versions of this conflict for quite some time to come.
We're out of time, Marc. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you.
Marc Champion is a Bloomberg Opinion columnist. You can find his work online at the Bloomberg Opinion website and on the Bloomberg terminal. You can also find him on Twitter at MarcChampion1. Here at Crash Course, we believe that collisions can be messy, impressive, challenging, surprising, and always instructive. In today's Crash Course, I learned that Vladimir Putin is much more entrenched and has much more wherewithal as a dictator, military force, and swayer of minds within Russia than I thought at the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. What did you learn? We'd love to hear from you. You can tweet at the Bloomberg Opinion handle @opinion or me @TimO'Brien using the hashtag Bloomberg Crash Course. You can also subscribe to our show wherever you're listening right now and leave us a review. It helps more people find the show. This episode was produced by Anna Mazarakis, Moses Andam, and me. Our supervising producer is Magnus Henriksen, and we had editing help from Sage Bauman, Jeff Grocott, Mike Nitza, and Christine Vanden Beilart. Blake Maples does our sound engineering, and our original theme song was composed by Luis Guerra. I'm Tim O'Brien. We'll be back next week with another Crash Course.